drinking, the boozing, and the...
we all know he's T-Croc, right?
Oh, yeah. Everybody don't know me. I'll get to who I am. It's really not important, but I'm talking about RootKits, so...
I want to have grown up in this family. That's what I want to. Like, I've got my ass kicked growing up. It's like, you're bad at sports. Whereas these guys are like, your Colonel isn't up to date. You know, why did I grow up in this household? That's what I want to know. I think I get the shit out of that deal.
Hold on, wait.
I really wanted to hear an introduction of myself because I'm sure it'd be funny. That's why I threw it over to you.
I think that was it.
Right. So this talk is going to be really interactive. I want to hear stuff. I want to hear comments. I want to hear thoughts. I'm not going to get down into the weeds of making rootkits like I usually do at these conferences. I'm actually going to talk more about the history, the evolution, current state of the art, and a little bit of how we got to where we are now and maybe what we can do about it, okay? I got a 12-pack of Magic Hat beer. So, cool questions, comments, any interesting things said.
Are you trying to say you're going to be there?
Whatever that means.
12-pack, and I'm going to give these away to y'all. If you come up with really cool comments, things to say, keep it interactive.
People are like, wow, you've got a lot of these. I call it the variety pack.
There you go.
Wait a minute, y'all three brothers?
I call it the napkin.
No.
Two.
Yes.
Which
One
one?
of these things is not like the other.
Yeah,
So, like he said, these beers are for you guys. I don't drink beer, and he's probably not going to drink any beer.
No, they're for y'all.
So please interact with us. I'll be running around handing out beers to people who, you know,
He's my beer bitch.
interact. Except for Private Pile over there, he's not getting any beer. He might even be dead. I don't want to wake him; he'll kill me. So I'm just going to turn this
Go straight up. Marines on him. Okay, who the hell is this guy? My name is Tyler, aka T-Croc, dumbass, any of the above. I'll answer to all. I'm a security consultant for a security company. I consult to Fortune 500 companies, government, education, facilities, banks, finance, all sorts of different industries. Whoever wants to pay me money, I'll come help you secure your stuff. Member of Hex90.org, Ghetto Hackers, Atari Ninja, lead researcher at Donkey on a Waffle.
And the only researcher at Donkey on a Waffle.
What's wrong with that? The lead. It's my site. Spoke at some conferences, HUK2, CarolinaCons, many other major conferences, many other minor conferences. And I'm a lazy bastard who makes his brother do all the grunt work and system administration for his websites.
all right.
So not only does he maintain all my websites, he is my beer bitch.
If the shit's broken, let me know.
Exactly. If my stuff's broken, contact him. All right, so here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to go over a definition of a rootkit, which, believe it or not, is not an easy thing to actually come up with. History and evolution, we're going to talk about the classes of rootkits. We're going to go through 4 different classes. Detection techniques of each of those classes. What does that mean to people from a forensics point of view? Okay, what happens when you're owned and you got a rootkit in there? How can you get some analysis of that system? And current and future research, and then Q&A. All right, what is a rootkit? Can anyone in this room give me a definition of a rootkit?
You get beer.
Professor was up first. Go.
It's a variety of tools cobbled together in order to obfuscate, provide a backdoor, and act on a system.
Okay, so I heard group of tools, backdoor, act on a system.
And obfuscate that you're there. in the first
Obfuscate that you're there. Okay, he gets a beer.
Did you go to like fucking dictionary.com?
I wikied it in my mind.
Anyone else want to give me
It's like, good news, you got a rootkit.
Which definition?
Made out of coconut.
Hooks APIs or hides itself from the descriptor tables of the file system. And
So Hooks APIs hide itself from the descriptive tables.
Stealthy is what you're getting.
Stealthy.
right.
All right. Good that makes sense.
You're cool.
Chop chop.
This type. I can't read it.
All right. So our favorite Wikipedia source. A
I
rootkit
think I wrote this.
is a program or combination of several programs designed to take fundamental control, yada yada, of a computer system without authorization by the system's owner and legitimate managers. That's all garbage. That's not what a rootkit really does. That's a bunch of programs that are going to pull in your box. Okay? Access to the hardware is rarely required, as a rootkit is intended to seize control of the operating system running on the hardware. Not really. Typically, rootkits act to obscure their presence on the system through subversion or evasion of standard operating system security mechanisms. Ding ding, that's the key to a rootkit, hiding itself. They're often Trojans, fooling users and believing they are safe to run on their systems. Techniques used to accomplish this include blah, blah, blah. Hiding file system, data operating system. Let's look at another one. A set of software utilities designed to run on specifically Linux type computers.
Yeah.
Lie!
All right. And assume control of them as the root user without the knowledge or permission of the owner. More recently, the term has been broadened to encompass kits of software utilities that are able to hide files. Okay, so they got part of it. They got the stealthy part. Stealth part is the key part. That's what I'm trying to show here. A set of programs used by hackers to gain access to information contained in your operating system and mask its presence, written for malicious purposes. Runs at the lowest level of computer. Well, not necessarily. We'll talk about that piece of it. Infiltrates the kernel. Not necessarily. I know, that's, well, then again, this is CompuKits. I don't know where the hell I got that anyway. So maybe you can just ignore this one straight off the bat, just by source. It has been used by manufacturers to hide DRM.
Say the word chagrin?
It does. Chagrin of the average computer user.
The founder who wrote that, he gets a fucking grade.
Exactly.
I think more computer definitions should use Yiddish words. I think. You got Spilkis in your internet tube.
We got them, get a plot!
In your internet
Texas State, the brilliant state of Texas, a hacker security tool that captures passwords and message traffic to a computer. Brilliant. A collection of tools that allow a hacker to provide a backdoor into a system. Classic example of Trojan horse software, and is available for a wide range of operators. Some of the stuff's right, some of it's not. My point is, they're all different, okay? So this is what I'm going to go by, okay? This is what I'm going to talk about. Is defined in this presentation as any code that's implemented in an effort to hide the existence of the code itself. In other words, it's really the stealthy portion of it. Owning the box is not a rootkit. It's mostly about hiding code, hiding the fact that it's there, and allowing surreptitious execution and control of the target system. Okay. Presentation will focus on the hiding of the code used to maintain long-term compromise of a target system. Oh, and don't believe everything I say, because probably most of this shit's made up as I go anyways. You should verify, just as my brother said, verify everything I say by doing your own research, because I'm liable to make mistakes up here.
RootKits are like that too, right?
Very likely. What's that?
RootKits are like that too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So let's talk about the history and the evolution of a rootkit. Stealth technology has been in existence since the mid-'80s. The first notable piece of stealth code was the brain virus. It was essentially a fat boot sector virus that hid the existence of the virus from detection. It hooked interrupt 13 and intercepted attempts to read the infected boot sector, presenting a modified boot sector instead. So that was the first piece of stealth malware.
That makes me feel really fucking old.
Yeah, you're older than the rootkit.
Anybody here actually know what interrupt 13 is used for, besides the description we just gave?
I saw a hand back there first.
Come on, old man.
You get a beer of this type, circuits board.
System calls?
Honestly, I don't know. Because I wanted to give away a beer. One of you guys gets a beer.
I honestly don't know.
What's your definition of N13 right here?
Oh, never mind.
No?
If he was right, then I guess I'm wrong.
I don't know if he's right either. He's the idiot to ask the question.
I don't fucking know. What do you
What do you got? N13.
It's the thing that allows you to, it tells you where the kernel is to boot the operating system. It goes from the BIOS to booting the kernel.
I don't think it's a boot situation. It's a looking at the fact.
I'm gonna make a sys call. Interrupt. That's what it is.
All right.
It's a system interrupt generally.
This means that if you looked at the boot sector using debug or any similar program and the virus was active in memory, everything would look normal. The fact that makes the virus the first real stealth virus. Stealth moves into the Unix world. Modified system binaries and log cleaning software begin to surface. So they've gone past just hiding itself, and they're actually adding modified system binaries and log cleaning software to keep the compromise longer term. Okay, so it's not just going to be a short hide it kind of thing. Let's keep it longer term as well. Sun Microsystems-based machines are compromised, and kits begin to develop.
Do you have a timeline, like rough decade in this thing?
This is still in the 80s, I think.
That's about
Later 80s.
Right. I'm just coming off the cover.
So the goals of these kits were to continue the root level, remote access, privilege escalation, hiding potential evidence, and going undetected by administrators. If these binaries would allow an attacker to maintain root level on the target host indefinitely, essentially log cleaning utilities were installed to to hide the existence of the digital evidence left behind during the original compromise and any future activities. So where'd they go from there? They added packet capture and sniffing code to the rootkits. Captured data as it traversed the network, extended compromises to other targets. It was extended to libraries for quicker installation. So they've gone from modifying individual binaries to modifying the libraries that the binaries call. I'll get into that a little bit later. Mid-90s, we started to see userland rootkits are getting detected. They came up with methods to detect userland rootkits relatively quickly, and they had to do something about that. The rootkit developers had to do something about that. In the 97, 99 timeframe, they relocated to the kernel level, and similar results, but they're far more difficult to detect. By placing the rootkit at the kernel level, the attack would be assured to be executing at the same or lower level than any tool attempting to detect its existence. Okay, so you get into a cat and mouse situation. The lower you go, anything above you can't tell you're there, okay? So now we're at the kernel level. Kernel level rootkits in the Unix world were based at that time on LKMs, loadable kernel modules.
Still changed.
No longer do we have to rewrite individual binaries. We now rewrite the kernel code affecting all the binaries on the system.
Right.
In the Windows world, it's achieved via hooking, device drivers, direct kernel, object modification, or DCOM. And essentially, at this point, the very core of the OS cannot be trusted.
Test. Okay. So one important distinction to make here is as you're moving into the kernel, right, if your rootkit misbehaves and crashes itself, it doesn't crash itself, it crashes your kernel and all of your userland processes go poof also. So as this code is moving more and more into the kernel, it's becoming more and more better at what it does. And it's much, much harder to detect because they want to make sure that they stay up at all times. As these rootkits are up in userland processes trying to hide themselves, they don't really care if they crash, they can respawn. Or
in other words, if you're writing stuff in the kernel level and you screw up, you're going to screw a lot of stuff up. If you're writing at a binary level, you might break the one binary you're trying to modify.
There's also really nothing you can do to, I mean, even if your data is encrypted or all of your keys are stored in memory at some point. So if the thing that's managing the memory has been compromised, there is no such thing as security anymore.
Within reason.
Now, hold on.
I'm going to argue against you.
So am I.
All right.
I'm calling shenanigans.
We'll fight to the death, much to my chagrin.
Somebody, yes, sir. What's up?
Can I get a bottle opener, please?
Are you comfortable?
I got one.
Or you guys can pass these around to my real keys and don't fucking steal them.
I was just about to say that. If we hear a loud grinding sound from the audience, it's either Kerbob's pants or someone's making keys.
So, for a beer, who can tell me if you're a rootkit developer, I'm sorry, if you're defending against rootkits, and somebody develops a rootkit at the kernel level, can anybody tell me what the most effective way to combat that would be? Yes, sir.
Easy. Take it off the disk, like the first guy here said, do it in a virtual machine in an image, because that way it is not running, and you can detect, you can go through the code and see what's there.
So,
Kind of.
Before, just as a corollary to yours, what if the VM server, here. So what if the VM server is rootkitted and you're running a VM on top of it?
Well, then my method would work.
Right. So I mean, it would work if you're on a clean VM system, but how can you
All right,
guarantee?
everybody put your hands down. Hands down. Hands
There are
up.
rootkits that can detect VMware too.
Right there. Reimage is going to be able to detect it. Okay, you were next.
Live CD.
Live CD. That guy gets a beer. That's one method. Anybody have another one?
Can't you do like a shared hashes database?
How about get lower than it? Get lower than it by implementing a VM, putting this OS into that VM, and you're now lower than it. Okay? You're now lower than the kernel. That's why I said kind of. You were right, but you weren't right. Kind of. How many beers we have left? I can't ask too many questions. You got
I need you to.
7? All right, so rootkit detection tools move to the kernel level to match the offensive, and you get the cat and mouse game again, right? So in the early 2000s, virtualized computing systems are created, VMs. A layer is created that is below the kernel, virtualized machine monitors. If rootkit loads under the kernel, it may be possible to intercept calls from the kernel to the hardware itself. Okay, so now the rootkit has moved another layer down. Get low, firmware rootkits. That's the next one down.
I think if that's where you are, I think you deserve to own the box. If you're fucking writing firmware, you win. You win.
I blog posted recently about a bunch of used hardware that's showing up on eBay
Intel can't even write their own
that
firmware.
is compromised. The hardware itself is compromised and Trojan. Okay, you're getting real low at that point.
That hurts.
Well,
Yes,
where
sir.
does hypervisors fit into this?
Hypervisor is a virtual machine monitor.
And it's sitting below your OS kernel. So like my MacBook has it. It's my MacBook or my Apple kernel is running, and the hypervisor is going to intercept calls that the Mac kernel is making. So it's actually sitting lower than your OS kernel.
Timing delay too, that's nice.
Yeah.
But the thing about it is, the lower you get, when you go down to your binary executables, most portable, the libraries less, kernel modules are very specific. Firmware, if I've got a rootkit that's in a firmware that's made for Windows, I just boot the Linux and I can detect it, or vice versa.
We'll talk about that when we get to detection stuff. Yeah.
You said that some hardware showing up compromised. Do you know what type of BIOS that was using? Was it the open BIOS? That's
You are always
down
eating
now?
every time you ask a question.
It was actually the particular posting I posted. I had gotten a hold of, I want to say FBI, don't hold me to that presentation on Cisco-related gear that was showing up on the market, on the reused market with modified hardware chips.
China.
Exactly, Chinese related.
Yeah.
And at the end, my blog's on there. If you go to some of the back posts, you can actually download that presentation if you're interested in checking it out.
It really bothers me that there are people out there who can write better firmware than the hardware manufacturer, because they've added stuff, right?
Yeah.
It blows my mind.
One of the Chinese pieces actually ended up in a naval facility.
Yeah, that's what the presentation talks about.
Yep.
Hey, and they also made it hard to where you could overboot and flash the firmware. That was one of the worst things.
Yeah, and we'll actually talk about that as well. We'll talk about that as well. So we've talked about 4 different classes of rootkits: application layer, library layer, kernel layer, and firmware layer. So this is the way they stack up: operating system layers and rootkits, right? We have the executable programs, the system libraries, the operating system kernel, the optional, not always there, virtual machine monitor, and then the hardware. Rootkit and subversive malware come in 5 distinct classifications. When looking at the typical computer system architecture, we see a direct correlation between computing architecture layers and the types of rootkit technologies in existence and being researched today.
So, if you're going to discuss detection of these, which we will later, as the rootkits are moving down, your detection has to move down with them, right?
To be most effective.
To be most effective, because
There are some ways to detect from above, but it's a lot more difficult, and I'll talk about that.
I call bullshit. So, think about it, right? If you want to hunt for rootkits, you have to be, the rootkit hunter has to be running in the kernel.
Same or below.
Same or below. So now, in order to check for rootkits, you're running some random binary in your kernel, some random blob of code in your kernel that you didn't necessarily write. Do you really trust it?
Unless you're the author of the
Unless you're the author, and then on top of it, that may go haywire and take your kernel down with it. So I mean, this is a pretty nasty business just detecting it, right?
So in
Detecting
operating
what?
system discussions, the top of the stack is known as user land. This is where the programs execute, each in its own virtual memory space. A program that is not statically compiled will typically link with one or more libraries at runtime to dynamically load functions and allow for code reuse. The system libraries is utilized by applications at runtime. They allow binaries to request functions from the library, such as printing to standard output, opening sockets, etc. Together, the top 2 layers, application library and application level and library layer, are considered the user space. Okay? Directly below that is the kernel. The kernel facilitates communication between user land and the underlying hardware. Requests are made from libraries and potentially application code itself to the kernel to provide access to files, directories, networks. In a typical system, the kernel then communicates to the hardware, and this layer, communicates, in a typical system, it communicates to the hardware, but we have the optional VMM layer, which essentially is an emulated piece of hardware, okay? So you have the hardware, then you have emulated hardware, and then your actual operating system.
Which actually means delay in time.
Say something.
No, you can get away with it.
Yeah, we're going to get there.
Actually means delay in time.
That's how you detect from above. One of the methods for above detection. So application layer rootkits, also referred to as user land rootkits, recompile binaries to replace system binaries and operate in a malicious way. Modification of DLL or EXE files in the Windows world, typically Trojan binaries, and binaries grouped together into kits, that's the term rootkits. Excuse me. These are typically either compiled from source code if publicly available, or patched binaries, reverse engineered and actually patched at the hex level. They're usually specific for the type of system being subverted, and as such, they're grouped into kits for that particular type of system, Windows, Linux, BSD, whatever.
And they're OS specific too. So like you got a rootkit that's for Solaris 7, and you're trying it against a Solaris 2.6 box, and it's going to overwrite a specific symbol in the library, you might be hosed because that symbol may not be in the 2.6 box, or maybe at a different location or something.
So once the compromise of the target system occurred, the rootkit would be deployed and system binaries are overwritten with the modified subverted binaries from the kit. Library layer. Library layer is still technically user land, installed into a target system and patch, hook, or replace calls to system libraries. Implementing a rootkit in this fashion allows the attacking process to stay hidden by returning modified data for requests and revealing the existence. The primary difference is, instead of modifying each individual binary that we want to hide results from, we modify the individual libraries, thus affecting multiple binaries that make those calls. We move one layer down.
Right. Why try to hide from the virus kit and we just replace it? Right.
So before you go to the next slide, we got some beers to give away.
Questions from my nerd brother?
So I think the next one is kernel level, right?
Yeah.
So one guy mentioned something back there. I'm not going to remember what he said. So what are some of the common methods that people use for implementing kernel level rootkits? Like, what do you hook? What do you intercept? It's for a couple
said
beers.
some of them before.
Somebody said some of them before. You get another beer.
You get another beer.
You get wasted on this, sir.
Isn't there one that there's a blank file list, and as it goes through the list, if it sees a particular one where that file's at, it links to the next one?
Yeah, so skipping file systems, right? So you
I
can
won't require you to tell me the names of the
Yeah,
tables,
but you're
but
getting
on the
into
right track.
hiding from a file system perspective.
Yeah, what's up?
Can't you hook the paging?
Paging?
Jesus
Right.
I'll let him have a microphone.
To hide itself from memory, right? So anything that's going to inspect memory.
Right, and they hook like the calls to the paging to the memory.
Yeah, that's one. I'll get you a beer. I'll take one more. We've got time to kill.
All my beer.
All right, Dad,
Slow down
over here.
All right, we're done.
We're only on slide 18. Halfway home. Don't give them all away yet.
The API hooking table.
You can hook like the SSDT.
Your SSDT ID tables. You're right.
Well, I'll take it.
All right.
You want to give to me?
You're off for now. You're cut off.
Good. Give someone else.
So kernel layer rootkits. Talk about LKMs first, I guess. LKM is a kernel subsystem that can be loaded and unloaded dynamically into the running kernel after the system boot process is complete. It's a dynamically loaded kernel module. Basically, it's runtime modification of the kernel code in Linux or Unix land. Windows achieves similar functionality by loading device drivers into the kernel. Similar ideas. The SSDT table is a table in kernel memory that holds the function pointers that contain the address for system calls. Okay, so Windows has this concept of an SSDT table, which is basically what you're talking about. That has all of, no, it's not. You're talking about actual process hiding. But anyways, SSDT table holds the function pointers for each of the system calls. So when the kernel makes a system call, or when userland makes a system call into the kernel, it looks at this table, and the table says that call's over here. So if you can modify this table to say that call's over here, okay, you can then execute whatever code you want and then redirect the call to the real one, have the response come back through and filter it, modify it, hide whatever you want to hide. A second Windows location of kernel hooking is modification of the IDT, which is the interrupt descriptor table. Is used to handle interrupts. The IDT tells the kernel how to handle interrupts that can be generated from any number of sources, keyboard, mouse, or when a system call is requested from user space.
So that'd be like that'd almost be like HAL level hacking.
What the hell? What the hell?
Hardware
Abstraction layer?
Yeah.
Kind of. No, these are Windows specific. IDT and SSDT are Windows specific.
No, every OS has.
Okay. I asked the OS, and
They're
it's
called
real
different
OS.
things, but I mean, it's the same idea. When you're typing on your keyboard, you're generating interrupts. So if you can hook those interrupt descriptor tables, function pointers, and point it off to your own code, same idea as an SSDT.
So when a system call is generated, the OX2E interrupt is triggered. This triggers the SSDT to take control and execute the appropriate system call by modifying. Well, I got a typo there. By modifying the IDT, a rootkit can effectively execute their subversive code in place of the SSDT code, thus blocking modifying the execution of a particular system call. So we just talked about this SSDT, the system call table. Okay, so if I modified the system call table, and somebody makes a call to it, what might be one way to detect that? Can anybody come up with a way to detect that? I get into it in a later slide, so if nobody knows, that's fine. How would you detect modification of that table?
Timing what on a base system, the timing that it would take for the normal call to come through, and
I don't know that timing is going to be that far off with SSDT modification. If you're going through virtual, if you're going through a VMM layer, then timing might be a good chance.
No. If you're going through a standard boot table or standard file table, there should be a detectable difference.
Not necessarily statistically detectable, because if you make a system call, that system call can be interrupted by an interrupt, right?
Okay.
Can you make some assumptions about the binary?
Good point.
You should know where the binary
I can figure for the binary, but
The binary does not. The binary doesn't know anything about the SSDT. It just says, I need to read from disk. Makes a call to the kernel that says, read from disk.
But if I
Doesn't
do
literally
it
say that. The kernel says, oh, I need to read. That's over here.
How
So
about-
the binary doesn't know.
All right. How about if you know the range of addresses that are typically in the SSDT, and all of a sudden you're making a call and you're going somewhere else, right?
But didn't they fix that with the security no execute thing where they relocated?
Not necessarily. That's something totally different.
Okay.
So the other method that I've seen implemented in OS is so the other method that I've seen implemented in OS is multiple copies of an SSDT or an IDT, and you hope to God that whatever rootkit you're trying to defend against doesn't realize that there's multiple copies out there. It's a cat and mouse.
I'll get into that on a later slide. I'll get into that on a later
And
slide.
then
You're talking about
periodically check the differences.
right. I'll get into that on a later slide.
Y'all made a good point on what.
Yeah, shut up. You're giving away too many of the slides. He's never seen the presentation. He's going off the
just
cuff,
told me
so.
like 20 minutes
I said, hey,
ago.
come
Come on
present
up
with
and
me.
get
I don't know this content as well as I should. Come present with me. So once again, my brother does all the real work and I get all the glory. So all accounting systems store accounting information in memory. And this is what Unq is talking about. DCOM is modification of kernel bookkeeping and recording systems as the kernel is running, such as your process chains. Modifying and unlinking those process chains can leave a process disconnected from the chain of processes, thus undetectable.
But it's still runnable.
Right.
Your process
Modification of live kernel data is a very fragile process. One mistake will inevitably result in an unstable system, and most likely the operating system will enter an unrecoverable state. DCOM is limited in that this technique can only modify data that is accounted for in the running kernel. If it's not accounted for in the kernel, you can't modify it, okay? Data such as lists of running processes, operational device drivers, active network ports, and thread details are all kept in the running kernel and can be modified by a DCOM-based attack. Something else to say?
No, I was just going to crack jokes.
All right, so the next level is virtualized rootkits, okay? So now we're to the kernel level. So how do they operate if we get below the kernel? So the lowest level rootkit in existence, kind of, is the virtualized rootkit. It's not been possible for other types of rootkits, with the exception of firmware rootkit, to gain a clear advantage over rootkit detection software because they operate at the same or higher levels within the operating system that the defensive counterparts do. If both an attacker and a defender operate at the same level, a stalemate occurs in which the attacker can modify its methods, but will be easily detected by defensive software that adds similar methods to its detection routines. This end result is a cat and mouse game of offensive modifications and defensive counter modifications, in which case nobody really wins. So the second way in which other types of rootkits are limited compared to virtualized rootkits is size. So the bigger a rootkit is at all those other levels, the more obvious it is. The more binaries you modify, the more system libraries you modify, the more kernel space you jack up, it's more detectable. When you're at the VM level, you're below the kernel. Size is kind of irrelevant. You can be as big as you want at that point, right? It really doesn't matter.
Within reason. VMs have to be small.
Well, they don't. They can be as big as you want them to be. Why is there, I mean, obviously you can, within limitation of the hardware, but...
Yeah, it's within limitation of
Right.
hardware.
Right, a Windows user would never know.
Yeah, it's hey, just Windows.
It doesn't mean that you can go write like a 5 gig VMM rootkit. You just don't have that much space for
Of course, right? Within reason.
Within reason, yeah.
So they're inserted below the general operating system, one layer abstracted from the hardware. They can track, drop, create, modify all requests to the hardware itself. Okay, two types. They're software-based and hardware-assisted. I'll get into both each on its own slide. And it's not limited by size. Bigger is easier to see.
Ain't that true, Ed?
In every other way, except for VM.
Not always.
So software-based.
Sometimes it's black and it's night.
Or if you got the minimalist theme going, and it's just a room, it's all white.
So software-based, it uses a VMM to manage the resources, the intermediary between the hardware and the operating system. It requires a reboot to load under the operating system. Traps all requests to the hardware filtering responses and presents falsified or filtered data. It's nearly undetectable to tools that are installed even in the kernel of the operating system. Okay, this is your more common, not that you're seeing a bunch of them yet, but your more common VMM layer rootkit. Yes, sir.
Oh, never mind. I was going to call shenanigans on the reboot one, but
If there's already a virtual machine running, could rootkit modify the running virtual machine?
That's one of the ways to detect or stop. That's a prevention method, would be to load your own virtual machine under your operating system, your own hypervisor. Absolutely.
But I mean, at the moment, your hypervisor isn't there anymore. He doesn't. Is up.
Hands up, anybody who's written their own hypervisor? Yeah, exactly. So I mean, these things are very difficult to write well. So I mean, there is no, look, I'm going to load Joe Random Guy's hypervisor yet, and that will stop me from hypervisor.
Because clearly that's safe.
Yeah.
So by inserting the virtual machine beneath the entirety of the original operating system and emulating the hardware via software representation, it's possible for the software-based virtualized rootkit to trap any and all requests to the hardware and present back a falsified and filtered result. The end result of which is a rootkit implemented in software at a layer that is virtually undetectable to any software installed in the original operating system, even at the most privileged kernel level.
So would you consider VMware to be a software-based hypervisor?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep, that's absolutely. Okay. So hardware assisted. So the difference between hardware assisted and software-based virtualized rootkits is that hardware assisted relies on the hardware itself to kind of shim a VM into place and then take the actually executing operating system and layer it on to the hypervisor that you just shimmed into place. So you don't have to reboot a hardware assisted virtualized rootkit. You can get it installed. It is pretty sweet. You can get it installed by forking or migrating the OS to a guest state on top of an operating system. Hardware itself must support virtual hosts, AMD and Intel VTX. Hardware is required to do a hardware-assisted virtualized rootkit.
This hardware is extremely common nowadays. MacBook Pros have them. I don't know if the 13-inch does. And most newer CPUs that you're buying nowadays have it because everybody's going virtualized. So hardware-assisted virtualization is great. But it's also a pain in the ass for security because now people can jack up your hypervisor.
So the hypervisor is loaded into the guest operating system via traditional kernel loading method. In the Windows case, this is a segment of driver code, device driver code. A section of memory is then allocated for the hypervisor and it is loaded into the system. The original operating system is then transferred to a guest of the newly installed hypervisor, and upon successful loading of the hypervisor, the loader code is removed from the original guest system, thus leaving no trace of the original installation of the hypervisor at the lower layer. So once you get it installed, you can't even tell that it was installed. There's no
Are you going to
evidence.
install a rootkit?
I guess I should stop and see Croc for a minute.
What's
We
up?
gotta get this guy out of here, so excuse him.
Say, dude.
Come on. Get up.
Same thing. It's my understanding that you can only have one host hypervisor. So if you're already running hypervisor, the hardware assisted wouldn't really make a difference, right? I mean, if you already, because you can't remove the hypervisor and install your
So,
own.
all right, so when we're saying hypervisor, right, there's hypervisor that's running below the OS kernel,
Yep.
and then there's a hypervisor that's running, like VMware. VMware's hypervisor is actually running as in the kernel as a service.
Yeah.
So you can still have a hypervisor underneath the host kernel.
That's
So
kind
there's
of a weird situation.
It's a weird situation, but it's doable, right? I mean, I run Parallels on my MacBook, and I could potentially virtualize the OS 10 installation and then run Parallels on top of that.
No, but
so
that's-
I think you're possibly confusing the word hypervisor twice. There's hypervisor that can run in user space.
But that would only be in
No.
software. That would not be hardware
Nick,
system. You can't
no.
run hardware system.
No. No.
There's yeah, you can only have one hardware-based hypervisor. Yes, yes, absolutely. And I think we covered that before. I don't know.
I missed that.
Yes, Nick, what's up, bud?
I was going to ask you, looking at some of the offerings that are going to be coming out from HP and IBM and stuff, they're building in hypervisors, VMware's, whatever it's called, into their actual servers and what have you. basically exploited at that level, even like firmware-based type stuff? Because I know you're getting ready to talk about it.
But that's not.
Honestly, I'm not sure. I didn't do any research into that newer stuff.
It's literally brand new.
Yeah, I didn't do any research into that newer stuff. What was the whole genesis for this presentation was I wrote an academic paper that was going to come out that's kind of a survey paper of rootkit technologies to date, and I didn't include any of that technology, so I don't know.
So my official answer is, honestly, I don't know anybody who's doing any research into that. The cutting edge research would be these stuff that we've been discussing. Right, that hardware's not even out, so I don't even know if theoretical attacks against it.
The stuff that's flashable from userland, like I'm gonna update my.
You're talking about firmware flashing?
Yeah.
That's what we're going to talk about right here.
I think it is actually.
That's what we're going to talk about right here.
And it is, the stuff
So
you talk about the
theoretically,
VMware on
it's
card,
probably this.
it's all ownable.
Okay. So yeah, I'm not sure the security stuff that they're layering into that.
There is none.
Okay, well, according to Al, there is none. Implemented at the hardware level, firmware layer rootkit. So now we're down real low, right? We're below essentially all the software layers. We're down to the hardware layer. It's the bottom of the stack. This would include peripheral devices, disk controllers, USB keys, processors, firmware, memory, etc. And it can be modified from way up in the stack, right? And essentially force modified firmware down into it. Think flashing your BIOS, flashing any number of things.
Creepy.
Isn't it?
That's creepy as hell.
That messes with you when you really start thinking about.
So I'm gonna get on a soapbox. Why the hell do we as consumers allow these type of designs to exist?
Stop getting down to my last slides. Get off the
God
soapbox.
damn it! I should get the remaining beers.
You can jump on that soapbox though at the end.
All right.
That's exactly where I'm going with that. So many pieces of firmware are run before the OS is even loaded. So even if you're going to put a virtual machine in there, a virtual machine rootkit or a virtual machine detection engine, this is run even before, right? So now you're even lower. Removal is extremely difficult. So the general concept of firmware rootkits is the idea that a firmware can be modified by the operating system directly. What makes them interesting is that many instances these firmware devices are executed at boot time, well before the actual execution of the OS, and it leaves a window of opportunity for a subversive piece of firmware to hook interrupts that may be called by operating systems at a later time. Once this rootkit has been installed in a piece of firmware, it is very difficult to remove. Reinstallation of the operating system, formatting the hard disk, and even physically removing and installing a new storage mechanism will not result in removal of this type of rootkit.
There's actually an asset management system that uses this technique. Damn it, I forget. It's included in Dell's now. Dell uses an asset management technique that actually utilizes
firmware modification.
Yeah, firmware modification to do this. So, yeah, if you own a Dell laptop, and it's a part of their corporate package, that asset can be traced when you plug it back into the network.
Yeah.
Basically sends a beacon so that they can find lost or stolen property.
So the affected piece of firmware must be returned to its safe state to ensure the removal of firmware rootkit.
So,
Next one.
no, that's it. So he had mentioned, like, you got this piece of firmware, okay, you boot the machine's gonna go through its post and everything, it's gonna initialize some random piece of hardware you have that's malicious. And that piece of hardware is gonna actually modify the loader or the Windows kernel binary to patch whatever it needs, right? So that would actually result in a modified SSDT or IDT or typical types of things that can be detected. The really creepy thing that I envision when I hear these kinds of things is, let's say a SCSI controller that's malicious, that is gonna take all of your data and do something bizarre with it, not write it to disk or make a call over to the network card and shuffle it down to the network card and have it mirrored out to China.
Right out to China.
And that's not modifying your OS at all. That's just honest to God malicious hardware. And that is creepy. How the hell do you detect that from up in user land, if at all?
Right.
So we're painting a gloom and doom scenario here.
Yeah.
The world sucks, just go off yourself.
So I have a personal belief on how a lot of this, not all of it, but how a lot of these things can be addressed, and hopefully we'll get into it in the end.
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure you knew my last. Yes.
Yeah.
There's some.
I got the beers to get rid of. Not yet. There's only two here. Oh, okay. Well, ask a question. Put him on the spot.
Anybody know what 1 + 1 is?
Two. Right there. All right, we're going to talk about detection. So general detection. Let's start at the top level. I'll give away one more of these right now. Let's start at the top level. Actually, let me go about it this way. Let's talk about each of the levels that we talked about. Can somebody try to give me ways of detection for each of them going through? You were first up. What do you got? Start at the top one, binaries. How do you detect binary modification?
Software like Tripwire.
Tripwire, right, hashing. So there's one. If we move to the library layer, how do you detect that?
I got to ask
What? Can you talk about the library layer? It's the same answer.
Oh, Tripwire?
There you go. Hashing. That'll work. Yeah, he gets one. And no beer for this, but how about detection of kernel layer?
Which flavor do you want, swill or?
Get below it, right. All right, so we'll just go through the slide. The first and most straightforward method of generally detecting rootkits is using a diff-based approach, aka hashing. The concept is simple in explanation, but somewhat difficult in practicality. A premise of all rootkit technologies, this is very important, is that they lie, okay? They fool the system and thus its users into believing a set of data that is not truthful. In the physical world, and the professor will probably understand this very well, one way of detecting lies is to review the situation from multiple witnesses and differing angles and comparing the answers and looking for deltas, right? Looking for two different things that don't match. It's like, you ask a kid and then you ask the other kid, you take them into separate rooms, and you look for the two different answers, right? Standard interrogation technique. So any subtle difference may indicate that someone is not telling the truth. The analogy is very similar to the diff-based approach to detecting rootkit implementations. A number of questions are asked of the operating system while running live on the potentially compromised host. The system is then rebooted directly to a secure read-only operating system typically located on a CD, and the same questions are asked of the underlying system directly from a trusted base. Okay? So you remove all the stuff that might be compromised. This obviously isn't going to work against hardware, right? Because that's still below you. But you remove all the stuff that's potentially compromised and you say, okay, what really is on the disk? Okay? And compared to looking at it from the operating system level and saying, what's on the disk? Where the stuff is going to give you lies. And you look at the delta. If they match, it's probably true. If they don't match, there's something wrong there. So if there are deltas in the return data, someone has lied. Technique is particularly useful when looking for file and data directory hiding. It doesn't matter if the stealth system is deployed in userland kernel mode or a VM. The results will differ when compared to the same questions asked from a known good secure base.
But how are you supposed to ask, what processes are running? What processes are really existing on my machine? When you reboot the machine, you lose all those processes.
Right, there are attacks that could exist completely in memory.
Right. So this is specifically, like I said, is specifically useful for file and data directory.
Right.
Exactly.
And in-memory analysis right now is kind of shitty. I know very good tools, very few good tools for good in-memory analysis.
And the downside of this approach also is lots of people hate rebooting their machines if they're production machines, right? If you got to take it offline for an hour, a day, however long it takes to do this analysis, it's offline. If you don't have anything up in its place to keep your business running, you're hacked. So I mean, this type of approach does work for the things he was describing, but it is very annoying to a production system.
Plus, not everyone likes to have 4 Sun Enterprise servers
Yeah.
hanging around
Yeah.
just to be able to take one down for
A rootkit check.
right. A rootkit.
Periodic 4-day rootkit check. Sorry, can't do business.
Okay, so directly examine the underlying hardware. It can be done live. It does not always require a reboot. And what they mean by that is using direct assembly calls to bypass the kernel directly and look at the hardware. SleuthKit is an example of that type of solution. Use tools that bypass the kernel and directly access the hardware. So that way it doesn't require a reboot. However, there's no known way from userland or kernel mode starting points to bypass a VM-based rootkit, so that's still going to get nabbed. That lies between the hardware and the operating system itself. You can also directly review kernel memory bypassing the API, so you can look at the memory, you can look at the disk, but you're still going to get nipped by a VM-based rootkit. So let's talk about application layer detection. This is why that gentleman got a beer. Use trusted binaries, compile them offline, statically linked, use a CD-ROM, and mount safe tools, that's a nice typo. But what if the mount system was compromised, okay? So let's say I compiled all my tools that I wanted to test with, I get them on a system, but the mount system is compromised. Damn. So realistically, if a rootkit is well designed, it can really, really screw with you. And live state analysis at the end of the day can never be foolproof, period. Gather cryptographic hashes, compare them against known good hashes, and check configuration files for modifications. Use a HIDS and get to the kernel layer and check get load.
Boy, none of that's expensive at all.
Does anybody know the mathematical proof which states that second bullet there? Live state analysis can never be foolproof? You know, because that right there.
Did you know that?
No, I don't. I'm just saying, if you can come up with a mathematical proof for stating that, you're going to put a lot of companies that say we have 100% rootkit detection on a live machine. They're going right out of business because your mathematical.
And they can feel good about yourself.
Bullshit. I'd argue that something like that might be doable.
So library layer, very similar to those used in application layer. Get your trusted binaries. This time it targets libraries and not binaries. You essentially get trusted binaries, look at the hashes, compare them. Static compilation is mandatory. If you don't statically compile your binaries, you're going to use libraries that are local on the host you're trying to analyze, and you're still going to be subverted, okay? Check the config files, get a HIDs, and go to the kernel layer, okay? That's how you're going to check for library layer. Say it.
For something like these two, using something like SE Linux help prevent any attacks to this layer?
I don't know anything about SE Linux, to be honest with you. Anybody answer that question?
Oh no, that's not the distro the NSA made it.
Yeah, it is.
I really don't know anything about
It can help protect it, as long as it's configured right. Yeah. Because you can't actually install binaries that aren't signed or whatever, right? You can't actually run binaries that aren't supposed to be there. So from a user perspective, yeah, it is. It's not up or it's dead. Whatever. I'll just scream.
Just yell.
So yeah, it should be doable, but you know, I bitched about this last year. SE Linux. Anybody run SE Linux?
Oh, yeah.
It's on Fedora.
Yeah, Fedora 6. Got it.
Yeah, so Fedora's had it for a while. Does anybody actually run Fedora? I think it's pretty good. I have some friends that code on it.
That's
Yeah, right there, right? So anybody, so you're running an SE Linux enabled system. Does anybody actually modify the SE Linux policy?
I turned it off.
You've turned it off. There it is. Big, big day. Yeah, that guy over there is doing the same thing. So that's my approach to SE Linux. It probably could solve some of these problems.
Yeah.
But it's such a pain in the
You're
ass.
off, just
Most
yell.
people just turn it off.
Just drop it in.
It probably could solve some of these problems, but it's such a pain in the ass, most people turn it off. Even in production environments, most people are turning it off. But if done right, it probably could solve these higher layer rootkits. And so for that, it's good.
Hey Vic, is the next speaker here? Okay. Because I'm running up on, I never in a million years thought I'd be bumping up against my max, but I have Talker Boy over here, so.
You told me to fill time.
Yeah, you filled your own time, not mine too.
I see, it sounds like just why we're not talking to it, so I think it's just Drunky McDrunkson over here.
Yeah. Woo! I need more water. Yeah, I got 3.
Okay, keep them, because we're going to save it till the end. Okay. So kernel layer detection. Significantly more difficult. Safe binaries won't work, it still relies on the kernel. Detect modification of the kernel tables. The SSDT has an expected range of addresses. If those addresses that are in that table are out of range, that's probably a problem. But what if the attacker points to completely fabricated tables? They create a completely fabricated table, okay, and works that way. We have to move up one layer and check that the table itself is in the appropriate range, right? So there's
Test that.
right. So yeah, again, chicken and egg type of routine. Same method can be used for kernel hooking and interrupt IDT, IAT, and IRP handlers. But obviously the most effective way is to get to the VM layer.
But it doesn't matter. If the hardware isn't safe,
We're not there yet. That's the last slide. Shut up. Sorry. You guys are like, L is a, wow, I'm not even going to repeat that on camera. I feel so dirty. All right.
I did not make that sign.
All right, so how do you detect decom, the stuff that Unq was bringing up? Detecting decom, the first to arrive has a distinct advantage. Hope to use a section of kernel that is not subverted, and do thread analysis and heuristic memory searching. So thread analysis enumerates every thread running on the system and backtracks it to matching process objects. So a thread must contain a reference to a process that owns it. It is possible to enumerate all processes thus running on the system via that method. If this information doesn't match the results from normal process walking, we have a situation where we have a modified kernel. However, this can be subverted by thread hiding rootkits.
Yeah, and that relies on first to arrive.
And that relies on first to arrive, absolutely.
So live analysis.
So heuristics scan the general kernel memory space looking for objects and object signatures that appear similar to those of a kernel process object. So scan the memory looking for things that look like processes. If you find them and it's not in the process list, you probably have a subverted kernel. Determine if the location in memory for the process object is linked to the active kernel process list. And if we find discrepancies, we most likely have a kernel rootkit installed. And the last, use a VM monitor, get to the VM layer, get below. And binary runtime analysis, which is actually a pretty cool idea. check that the binaries in runtime that are being run do not directly modify the kernel. Okay, most of your binaries that you're running are not going to directly get in there and jack up your kernel, specifically certain sections of the kernel, which could be dangerous, subversive type modifications. Stop them before it happens. Okay, an ounce of prevention, pound of whatever, I forget.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. What were you pointing at? What do you want?
I was gonna, yeah, that would work as long as you're first to arrive. If you're not first to arrive, the kernel can lie about, oh, this binary is not modified.
All right, firmware layer detection. Theoretical and cutting edge. Disassemble the ROMs themselves and call Nick for help. No thanks. Sign firmware updates. Physical jumper on the writable ROMs. Get in there. You want to flash something? Open up your box, flip the jumper, flash it, flip it back. That way you know somebody didn't hit you with a worm or virus and jack up your firmware. Okay. So when you're yeah, or use a switch. Sure. Sure. So when you're disassembling the ROMs, is it a known good ROM image? Which interrupts does it hook? Does it contain 32-bit code? Are there any suspicious strings or addresses? What does it actually do? All the stuff that I am never in a million years going to take time to do. Static analysis of each individual ROM on a system is the most effective, yet the most time-consuming method of detecting firmware-level rootkits.
Time-consuming is an understatement.
Exactly. As firmware rootkits continue to be researched, additional countermeasures must be developed. The concept of a trusted platform module should be designed and implemented on systems that must maintain a high level of security assurance.
I am 100% sure this system is safe, although now it is 14 years out of date.
So let's talk about virtualized layer detection. I actually screwed these slides. We should have done virtual before firmware, but install the detection engine below the rootkit, utilize secure hardware, boot from a CD-ROM or other secure boot system, and create the VM first below the rootkit. From above the rootkit, and this is what that gentleman who's now sitting in the back drinking the free beer was commenting on earlier. Monitor and compare timing-based functions, okay? So if you send a, so let me take a step back. The most effective way of detecting a virtualized rootkit is to install the detection engine at a layer lower than the rootkit itself. By installing the detection components below the rootkit hardware, and data access does not have to travel through the potentially malicious virtualization layer. The primary method of rootkit detection is determining locations where the underlying virtual machine has caused the guest operating system to either behave differently than normal or in a fashion that is not standard. So monitor and compare timing-based functions. So, yeah, dual core techniques. Run a counter thread on one core, execute a synchronized thread on the main core, and then compare the results. Any skew indicates that one of those cores is going through a virtualized rootkit. If there's deltas, you've got a timing-based detection. Let me go back to the slide. Detect any additional overhead hindered by temperature. This technique can be hindered by temperature or power fluctuations. Any hardware that modifies its power output based off of temperature or based off of any other technique is going to screw up your timing.
Lots of users are doing nowadays.
It's going to, yeah, exactly. That's a lot of them. It's going to screw up your timing anyways, and you're not going to be able to detect it that way. Then this one's cool. Execute buggy behavior directly in a processor. So a lot of the processors have bugs, but the VM rootkit doesn't think to implement the bugs. They implement all the legit stuff. So execute something that's going to cause a problem. And if it doesn't cause a problem, you may have a VM layer rootkit, right? Because it wasn't implemented properly.
So wait, when you say timing, are you talking about actual counting, like seconds or milliseconds or something, or are you talking about
clock cycles?
Okay, so you're not talking about like actual instruction execution.
Individual
so
clock cycles.
A given instruction that you're telling the processor to run has a known execution time, right?
How many cycles does it take to execute?
How many clock cycles does it take to execute this particular instruction? If it's virtualized and your hypervisor is going to track down to real hardware, it's going to take more time because it has to set up the call to the real hardware and everything and then return it back to you. So you can actually get discrepancies in this particular instruction in a virtualized environment takes N, this particular one takes N, or in a regular environment takes N, and in a virtualized environment it'll take N plus some delta.
So this
stuff,
that detection method is extremely very cutting edge, like within the last year. And I recommend looking up any of the papers by Dino Daizovi at Monsanto. I think he did it. A number of the Monsanto guys.
I'm sure it's also very cheap.
Thomas, I can't pronounce his name because it starts with PT.
They presented this argument, and
it was the whole blue pill, red pill thing that happened last year. I don't know if you all saw that or heard of that, but look it up.
That's their argument, and read up on it if you want more.
And last but not least here, prevention, again, is probably easier than detection. Load a preemptive hypervisor that prevents loading a malicious hypervisor. Get there first. intercept and deny alert on any attempt at installation of a new hypervisor. And a minimalist, what's interesting is if you're doing this technique, a minimalist design will work because stealth is not a requirement of that hypervisor. So all you have to do is get in there, jam your way in there, have a small little hypervisor that's not a whole lot of fat overhead, but it stops somebody else from jamming in there too. So what are the forensic implications of this? So when you're the first responder to an incident, do you turn off the machine?
No.
Do you do live state analysis? Results will be steadfast if you turn off the machine. You know what you're getting, okay? Because there's no subversive stuff. You take out the disk, you know what you're getting, but you lose access to data stored in memory. If you do live state analysis, the results are less than certain because RootKits will screw with live state analysis. So you're kind of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. I mean, so what do? First, you do your live state analysis because you're going to lose that if you turn it off, okay? You determine the validity of the incident. The first responder does these activities. When you don't want the subject to know, this might be another spot where you're going to do live state analysis because you don't want to have to reboot the box and inform them that you were there. Do memory acquisition. Software-based memory acquisition can be subverted via a rootkit. Hardware-based memory acquisition requires physical hardware that's very expensive and may also be subverted in theory. So once again, you're kind of screwed, but get all the information you can before you turn the box off because later on you're going to have, again, you've interviewed a witness to get a bunch of details from, and you're going to interview another witness later when you're doing your dead state analysis, okay? And then you can look at those deltas.
What about latent memory recovery? I know that's kind of...
That's cutting edge as well. There's actually recently a paper about...
Right, we're going to freeze it.
Freezing the chip and
that just gives you a few more minutes or seconds.
Yeah, but it's a potential approach. I mean, like, so if... I don't know of anybody besides a nation state level that's going to go that far to prove they weren't rootkitted. Most people are just going to say, well, shit, I can't say with 100% certainty I wasn't, so I'm going to rebuild from a known clean state. But I mean, you could take that approach if you've got billions of dollars to free up.
Well, you're just rebooting it to a boot disk. That first thing it does is dump memory to a stick or something.
Yeah.
So
in that approach, yeah, that might be a faster way of doing it than, like, you know, pulling chips out. Like,
so all first responders remember to carry your dry ice and Freon.
Doesn't work with UCC memory.
Right. It's going to be deployed with your in-case stuff. Can't hear you, brother, louder.
If you can trigger to use something like Solaris cracked up, dump it all with that real crack.
It's probably subversive via modifications at lower levels. You can block that as well. Now, again, what you're talking about here is the Uber rootkit that blocks everything. The point is, there's not probably a rootkit that's going to block everything. It's going to only maybe catch some of your things. That's why you want to do all the stuff you can before you kill it, and hope one of them is somewhat accurate.
So really, I mean, how pervasive is it? So you think the cheap kill for 99.9% of most boxes out there is the Visual Basic script virus that, you know, still every desktop machine is still vulnerable to because no one's run a Windows update, you know, for 37 years. This is, to me, really seems like a targeted corporate attack, right? There's a particular piece of information that you want to get, you know, a particular thing about this company's environment.
The lower you go, the more targeted it's going to be.
Right.
And the harder it's going to be to do.
Exactly.
I mean, a binary level rootkit is going to be...
I mean, to get somebody to install a piece of hardware, that's going to...
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you might be getting into nation-state activities. You might be getting into corporate espionage activities. Real serious shit there.
Yeah.
If you're up at the top levels, you know, userland rootkits, that could be just some dude own you and, you know, drop FU rootkit on there. Actually, FU version kernel, but, you know, drop some kind of higher level one up there.
Have y'all ever used rootkit revealer? How far does that go down?
It's a kernel.
Is it kernel?
Good thing
Some of them are actually like not kernel level; they're just userland level. Some of them are kernel level.
But you're running
that one in particular, but they never go lower than kernel.
Yeah, but in a best case, I don't know that one in particular either. I've heard of it, but I haven't done any research into it. But does it run at userland or kernel level? If it runs at userland level, kernel level can hide from it. If it runs at kernel level, the best you can get is a 50-50. It may or may not catch it.
There's also some research with rootkit reviewing where somebody's detecting that, and when it sees
exactly
running it
hides itself.
re-links itself back up.
Exactly, because the best you can get if it runs at the kernel level is a 50-50. Because if the rootkit that's installed knows how to hide from it, it's not going to catch it.
It's a question of trust, right? If you're in userland asking the kernel, are you malicious? Do you have bad code running? The kernel can just say, nope, I'm not, even though it is. But if you're in kernel level and you're asking the kernel, are you malicious? It can still lie to you. But if you're down underneath, you can say, do you have any malicious code or anything that's going on that I should know about? It can't lie to you. You need to get lower than what you're trying to detect to have a potentially 100% detection.
The firmware of RootKits, how theoretical is that? How many have actually been found?
I don't know of any found.
If they're theoretical. All right, current future research, creation and detection of virtualized rootkits, currently being researched by a lot of people. It's a big thing. Creation and detection of hardware system virtual rootkits is also very, very cutting edge right now. Moving firmware rootkits from the realm of theoretical to practical. The real thing that needs to be researched, in my opinion, is implement fixes in the hardware. Create a secure computing platform for high assurance uses. Okay.
Yeah.
Again, at some point, that's really going to be the only way to ensure that you can be safe from this type of solution. It's a secure, trusted hardware. I'm willing to bet the government already has some of these types of designs at least in place. So maybe I'd lose that. We'll talk about that later.
Is that the most you can say?
So questions and discussions, check out don'tgetwaffle.org for interesting post, comments, and research. That's my blog I post to. Leave comments. I promise I read them. But right now they're broken, so tell them to get his lazy ass up and fix my comments.
I'll fix it on Monday. It'll be done Monday, or even tomorrow.
Yeah.
So in reality, put me on if I'm wrong here, but I was thinking about what the corporation cares about, which is the data on the box. And if they detect the rootkit, that's fine. They found a rootkit or they suspect a rootkit on the box. But now they can't trust anything that was on there anymore. So you really just have to lose everything.
Well, you can't lose it, right? I mean, at some point you have to
You got to draw.
it can all be used as evidence, but to what level is it trusted? And that's debatable, right? So. Sure, you got a rootkit on there. Is it, you're pulling memory off, is that stuff real or not? It's difficult to tell. But you have to cross-reference that with other witnesses that are going to corroborate.
I'm not talking about the information from what you pull there. I'm talking about the data that the company cares about, the stuff that could be compromised.
That's just general forensic analysis.
They're trying to pull out to say.
Right.
You got to roll back to a known good point.
Remember though, the most secure thing is completely unusable.
So why is Microsoft not more secure?
So,
why do we still use computers? I don't know.
3 beers left, so please give us. Yeah.
All right. What about like packet analysis as far as detecting these things? Don't they all have to phone home eventually?
Not necessarily. Who said they
Not
have
at all. They can sit there and wait for somebody to come harvest it.
Yeah.
Harvest the data.
Like secret the
Right.
data out.
Yeah.
I'm going to sit here and wait for you to plug in a USB key and give you
anything.
Right. So, and who said they even had to do that? What if their whole goal was to just sit there in memory collecting data until at one point they just fire off packets rather than streaming packets? They just fire off a huge batch and then they prepare if they ever get caught.
We're not even doing that. They could just want to corrupt the data.
So if they're constantly streaming data out from your machines, then outgoing network monitoring is a great idea.
But there's also, then you get into the whole concept of covert channels.
Yeah,
right. And
covert channels.
you could covertly ship the data out in
or they can just
ones
flat
and
out
zeros
patch
on a
everything
typing
out.
channel. I mean, there's a million ways to get the data out subversively. So, but you can get some beer for that.
No, hell yeah.
Nothing
What about I/O? Like if you're connected to a SAN, what about any of them monitor it via the SAN device or something? Like do SAN sniffing instead of like a network sniffing thing? To be able to like validate some sort of,
detection at the communication channel between the storage device. That's an interesting concept.
You want a beer?
I think it's a beer for that, sure. Yeah, this guy right here. What?
Using the 13 thing, it's a BIOS. It's nice.
So it's okay. Wes, shut up.
About the question you asked earlier about if there was mathematical proof about whether to 100%. I know there's a mathematical proof that you cannot have a debugger that can debug an arbitrary process, and that has been proven.
So that would be
different from
but it's closely
debugging instance of the process.
Right. So that's closely related. It's just it was one of those thoughts that occurred to me. Like so, I used to do security, and I would have vendors come in and say, "Oh, we can detect 100% of rootkits from user land," and I would just throw them out. Like you're lying. Goodbye.
What did he say?
That guy gets a beer.
Can somebody repeat what he said?
He said he knows of a mathematical proof, and I'd love to if you could email me the information about it. Proof that a debugger cannot debug an arbitrary process because it has. I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, If the debugger says, I want to debug this particular process, it has no idea if it is actually debugging that process because it has to ask the kernel for that information. The kernel can lie. So that's the approach that, if you can prove that from a rootkit detection standpoint, a lot of companies are going to potentially be mad at you.
Anything else before we wrap it up and let the next guy who's now here talk? I think we killed enough of everybody's time. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah!